Close your eyes for just a moment. Imagine waking up in the 14th century, not as a knight, not as a king, but as a noble woman with a single, consuming purpose before the sun has even fully risen. You must be beautiful today, and beautiful in this cold, candlelit world means something that would stop your heart if you saw it walking toward you on a modern street. You rise from a straw-stuffed mattress in a chamber that never quite loses its chill. The fire burned low in the night, and the stones around you have soaked up the cold like old bones. A servant brings a basin of water. You do not drink it. You study your face in a warped bronze mirror that bends your reflection just slightly, giving everything a dreamlike, distorted quality. And what you are looking for, what you are desperately hoping to see staring back at you, is the face of someone who looks almost dead. This was not vanity in the way we understand it today. This was survival. In medieval Europe, particularly from the 12th century onward, and reaching a kind of fever pitch by the 1400s, pale skin was not simply attractive. It was a social language. It told everyone in the room, without a single word spoken, exactly who you were and exactly where you stood. Pale skin meant you had never laboured beneath an open sky. It meant your hands had never pulled a plough or carried a water bucket across a muddy field. It meant you were wealthy, leisured, and untouched by the grinding machinery of peasant life. To be pale was to be powerful, and to be tanned even slightly was to be suspect. But here is where it gets truly unsettling. Simply being pale was not enough. The standard was not just fair skin, it was translucent skin, the kind of skin where you could trace blue veins along the forehead and throat like rivers on a map. The ideal woman looked as though she were made of fine porcelain held up to candlelight, thin enough to see through, luminous in all the wrong, haunting ways. Scholars and beauty historians sometimes describe this aesthetic as deliberately cadaverous, and that word is not an exaggeration. The closer a woman looked to a beautiful, well-dressed corpse, the more desirable she was considered. Achieving this look required commitment of the most dangerous kind. Women would mix thick, paste-like cosmetics from ingredients that should never touch human skin. Vinegar was common, sharp enough to strip colour from the cheeks over time. Crushed pearls were stirred in for their faint, luminous quality. And then, most chillingly of all, there was white lead. Ceruse, as it was formerly known, was the foundation of medieval beauty. It smoothed over imperfections, bleached the complexion, and gave the skin that ghostly flattened appearance everyone craved. It also burned on contact. It corroded the skin with repeated use, eating slowly through the outer layers, and over months and years it leached into the bloodstream, poisoning quietly and systematically from the inside. Women knew it was dangerous. Some of them knew, and they kept applying it anyway because the alternative, showing up to court with warm, human-coloured skin, felt infinitely worse. She has not eaten today. Not really. A few sips of thin broth in the morning, watered down and barely warm, taken standing up because sitting felt too much like settling in for a meal she was not supposed to want. It is early afternoon now, and her stomach has been quietly protesting for hours, but she has learned to interpret that hollow ache not as hunger, but as progress. The slight dizziness when she stands too quickly, the way her cheekbones have begun to cast small shadows in the right light, these are not symptoms. These are not symptoms. These are achievements welcome to the medieval beauty ritual nobody put in the illuminated manuscripts, but everybody practiced anyway. If the lead paste and the bloodletting were the dramatic, visible performances of aristocratic beauty, then starvation was its quiet, private engine. Noble women across medieval Europe understood, with a clarity that required no physician to explain, that the face they were chasing could not be achieved on a full stomach. The sunken cheek, that slightly hollowed, ethereal concavity beneath the cheekbone, was considered one of the most desirable features a woman of standing could possess. It suggested delicacy. It suggested refinement. It suggested, most importantly, that you were the kind of person who existed on a higher plane than something as common and animal as appetite. Food was complicated territory in medieval noble culture in ways that go far beyond simple vanity. The church cast a long shadow over the dining table. Fasting was holy. Restraint at meals was virtuous. A woman who ate sparingly was demonstrating not just aesthetic discipline but spiritual elevation, proof that her soul had mastered the body rather than being dragged along behind it. The line between religious devotion and beauty practice was not merely blurry in this world. In many cases, it did not exist at all. Starvation wore two faces, and both of them were considered admirable. But hunger alone was apparently not efficient enough for some. Enter the lemon. Across northern Italy and France in particular, there circulated among noblewomen a persistent and genuinely bizarre beauty tip involving the repeated application of lemon juice to the face, and particularly to the cheeks. The logic, such as it was, held that the acid would gradually deflate the soft tissue, drain some of the fullness from the cheeks, and accelerate that sunken, sculpted quality everyone was working so hard to achieve. Women would rub cut lemons directly onto their skin, sometimes holding the fruit pressed against their cheeks for extended periods, the citric acid burning steadily against whatever barrier the skin could offer. It did not work, at least not in the way they hoped. What it did do was strip the outer layers of skin repeatedly, leaving the complexion raw and sensitized, which ironically made the lead-based cosmetics they applied afterward absorb faster and penetrate deeper. A beauty routine accidentally engineered to poison more efficiently. Medieval skincare in a single devastating sentence. The leech treatments added another layer of grim ingenuity to all of this. Leeches had been a staple of medieval medicine for centuries. Their application considered a reasonable response to almost any ailment from fever to melancholy, but by the high medieval period they had migrated from the physician's bag into the noblewoman's beauty routine with startling naturalness. Applied to the face, they drew blood to the surface and then away from it, temporarily blanching the skin to an even more dramatic pallor. Applied near blemishes, they were believed to drain whatever dark or corrupted humor was causing the imperfection. The sensation was described in surviving texts with a kind of studied neutrality that suggests these women had simply decided that feeling things about it was a luxury they could not afford. What emerges from all of this, from the hunger and the acid and the leeches, and the quiet daily discipline of disappearing, is a portrait of women engaged in an enormous and largely invisible labor. They were working constantly, spending tremendous physical and psychological energy on the project of becoming less present, less warm, less alive-looking. The ideal they were chasing was not health or vitality, or even a conventional attractiveness. It was akin to beautiful erasure, the suggestion of a person so refined they had nearly transcended the inconvenience of having a body at all. There is something almost meditative about the way she sits, perfectly still, shoulders squared, hands folded neatly in her lap, while a servant works methodically above her with a pair of small, sharp tweezers, not shaping, not tidying, pulling, from the very front of the hairline, dragging it back inch by careful inch across the forehead until what remains is a smooth, unbroken expanse of bare skin stretching from the eyebrows all the way to the crown of the skull. She does not flinch. She has learned not to. This is simply Tuesday. If the pale skin obsession was the foundation of medieval beauty, then the high forehead was its crown jewel, literally. From roughly the 13th century through the 15th, the forehead was considered the most aristocratic feature a woman could possess. Not her eyes, not her lips. Her forehead, the bigger, smoother, and more dramatically domed it appeared, the more refined and intelligent and spiritually elevated she was assumed to be. A wide forehead suggested a mind unclouded by base instincts. It suggested proximity to God. It suggested, above all else, that you were the kind of person whose face deserved to be painted and remembered. The problem, of course, was that foreheads come in all sizes, and hairlines are stubbornly inconvenient things. So medieval women simply removed whatever got in the way. Plucking the hairline was standard practice among noblewomen across England, France, and northern Italy. Some women pulled it back a full inch or two. Others went further, restructuring the entire upper frame of the face until the hairline began somewhere near the middle of the skull. The pain was remarkable and entirely beside the point. Beauty in this era was not supposed to be mortal. It was supposed to be impressive. But the hairline was only the beginning. Eyebrows, in much of medieval Europe, were considered disruptive. They added expression to the face, which was problematic. An expressive face suggested emotion, and emotion was messy, unpredictable, and deeply unfashionable. The ideal medieval face was serene to the point of blankness, smooth and unreadable as a drawn curtain. So the eyebrows went too, shaved, plucked, or rubbed away with abrasive pastes until the upper face became a clean, uninterrupted plane of pale skin stretching from lash line to crown. Look at the portraits from this period, and you will see it everywhere once you know what you are looking at. Jan van Eyck's women. The faces in the Wilton diptych, Queen Isabella of Bavaria, whose portraits show a forehead so dramatically exaggerated it reshapes the entire geometry of her face. These were not artistic choices made in isolation. They were reflections of a deeply held cultural belief that the human head, properly arranged, should resemble something closer to architecture than anatomy. Children were not exempt from this pressure. There are historical accounts, uncomfortable ones, of young girls having their hairlines managed from an early age. Soft, abrasive cloths rubbed repeatedly along the hairline to discourage regrowth. Walnut oil applied to the roots, which was believed to weaken the follicle over time and slow the return of unwanted hair. The goal was to train the body into conformity before it had a chance to develop any inconvenient ideas of its own. And underneath all of it, beneath the plucking and the shaving and the carefully constructed silhouette, was something more profound than vanity. The high forehead was holy. In religious iconography across medieval Europe, saints and the Virgin Mary herself were almost always depicted with that same smooth, expansive brow. To shape your face in that image was not merely to be fashionable. It was to participate in something sacred, to wear your virtue visibly, to signal through the very architecture of your skull that your soul was ordered, elevated and pleasing in the eyes of heaven. It cost you your hair. It cost you your eyebrows. And somehow, incredibly, it felt worth it. Open your mouth and smile. Go on. In the 21st century, that is an invitation to confidence, a social reflex so automatic we perform it dozens of times a day without thinking. Now imagine performing that same smile in a wealthy English household in the year 1450 and understanding with complete clarity that what you are revealing when your lips part is not a liability to be hidden, but a status symbol to be displayed. Because in medieval Europe, at the height of aristocratic culture, black teeth were beautiful, not tolerated, not explained away, actively, deliberately, enviably beautiful. This requires some unpacking, because the instinct to recoil is immediate and understandable, but follow the logic and it becomes, in its own twisted way, completely coherent. Sugar in medieval Europe was not the cheap, ubiquitous commodity we know today. It was an exotic luxury imported at enormous expense from the Middle East and later from early colonial plantations, available only to those wealthy enough to afford it in meaningful quantities. To have black decayed teeth was to wear the evidence of your sugar consumption directly on your face. It announced with every smile that you had been eating sweetened delicacies, honeyed confections, and expensive imported treats in quantities sufficient to rot your enamel. Your ruined teeth were your receipt. Your decay was your flex. Queen Elizabeth I, arriving at the later Tudor end of this tradition, was famously noted by foreign visitors to have teeth that were extremely black, a defect the English seemed subject to from their great use of sugar. That observation was not intended as a medical warning. It was a social observation about national wealth and aristocratic habit. Elizabeth's blackened teeth were inseparable from her image as a powerful and indulgent monarch. They were part of the portrait, but here is where the story curls back on itself in that particularly medieval way, simultaneously logical and completely maddening. While black teeth were fashionable among the wealthy, breath was still a concern, and the medieval solutions to bad breath were creative in ways that range from the genuinely reasonable to the deeply alarming. Chewing on cloves and fennel seeds was common and actually effective, both having genuine antibacterial properties that medieval people stumbled onto through trial and observation rather than chemistry. Mint was used widely. Rosemary was tucked into the mouth after meals with the optimistic confidence of a people who had decided that smelling like a herb garden was the next best thing to actual dental hygiene. Then there were the tooth powders. Recipes survive in medieval household manuscripts, and they make for uncomfortable reading. Burnt rosemary mixed with salt was relatively benign. Powdered charcoal had a certain accidental effectiveness, but others call for ingredients that should never approach a human mouth under any circumstances. Powdered animal bones ground fine enough to use as an abrasive. Urine, both human and animal, recommended in various texts for its ammonia content, which was believed to whiten and strengthen the enamel. Applied with a cloth or a rough-bristled brush fashioned from twigs, these preparations were scrubbed against teeth that were simultaneously being destroyed by sugar and theoretically being maintained by everything else. The contradiction at the here, too, of medieval dental beauty was total and apparently invisible to the people living inside it. You ate sugar to demonstrate wealth until your teeth blackened and fell. You then applied powders and pastes to manage the damage, some of which accelerated it. You smiled to show the evidence of your prosperity, while breathing through a mouth that smelled of cloves and desperate optimism. And through all of it you understood, because medieval beauty always came back to this, that your teeth were not really about health. They were about legibility. They told your story the moment you opened your mouth, and in a world where your body was your biography, that story had better be the right one. Decay, it turned out, had a dress code, and if you could afford it, you wore it proudly. Picture a child of 7 standing very still in a dim stone room, while her mother's hands work efficiently behind her, pulling laces tight across a small, rigid frame of stiffened linen and whalebone. The child breathes in shallow little sips because deeper breathing is no longer entirely possible. Her spine is pressed flat against a board that has been strapped to her back since she was old enough to walk steadily. She does not complain. Complaining would suggest that she does not understand what she is being prepared for, and she understands perfectly. Her body is a project. It has been one since birth, long before the Victorian corset became the symbol we recognize today. Medieval Europe had already built an entire philosophy around the controlled, compressed, architecturally managed female body. It did not begin with vanity, at least not openly. It began with theology. The body in medieval Christian thought was a dangerous and unruly thing. Left to its own devices, it slouched, softened, spread, and betrayed its owner with appetites and impulses that pointed away from heaven and toward something considerably less respectable. Discipline was not cruelty. Discipline was not cruelty. Discipline was devotion. To shape the body was to shape the soul living inside it, and a woman whose figure was controlled and contained was a woman whose virtue could be trusted. This belief translated into physical practice with remarkable thoroughness. Stiff linen stays, heavily structured and bound tight around the torso, were worn by noble women from surprisingly young ages. They compressed the rib cage, flattened the stomach, and forced the posture into a rigid, upright line that read as composure, even when the wearer felt anything but composed. The silhouette these garments created was not entirely unlike a column, something architectural and permanent, more monument than body. Movement became careful and deliberate because careless movement was simply not available anymore. The posture board took this further. Flat wooden boards, sometimes padded with thin cloth and sometimes not, were strapped along the spine of young girls during waking hours to prevent any curvature or relaxation of the back. The goal was a perfectly vertical carriage, shoulders drawn back, neck long, chin lifted at precisely the angle that suggested breeding without suggesting arrogance. It was a fine line, and the board enforced it mechanically, removing the possibility of error. Girls trained this way from early childhood often internalized the posture so completely that removing the board made no difference. Their bodies had simply forgotten how to curve. Waist binding went hand in hand with all of this. Strips of cloth wound tightly around the midsection were common practice, and unlike the later Victorian obsession with an exaggerated hourglass, the medieval ideal was less about creating curves and more about erasing them. A flat, smooth, uninterrupted torso was the goal. Roundness suggested appetite. Appetite suggested weakness. And weakness, in a world where your body was a public declaration of your inner character, was not something any noblewoman could afford to advertise. What makes this chapter of history particularly striking is how invisible the suffering was designed to be. A woman moving through a great hall in her structured stays and carefully managed posture looked, to every observer, like the picture of effortless grace. The effort was entirely the point and entirely hidden. The pain of compressed ribs, the ache of a spine held rigid for hours, the shallow breath that became so familiar, it stopped feeling like a deprivation. None of it showed on the surface. The surface was serene, contained, and perfect. And perfection, in medieval Europe, always came at a price that only the wearer knew how to calculate. Lean in close for a moment, not too close. That, as it turns out, is excellent advice for anyone within arm's reach of a fashionable noblewoman in 14th century France, because beneath the rosewater dabbed carefully at her wrists and the dried lavender tucked into the folds of her gown, beneath the cloves she has been chewing since breakfast and the pomander ball of orange peel and spices swinging from her belt, there is something else entirely. Something older and considerably more honest. The medieval world smelled nothing like the image we have constructed of it, and the beauty rituals built around fragrance tell us more about fear, faith, and survival than they do about vanity. Let us begin with the bath, or more precisely with its absence. The popular modern myth that medieval people never bathed is an exaggeration, but the truth underneath it is genuinely complicated. Public bathhouses existed in most major European cities through much of the medieval period and were used regularly by people across the social spectrum. Private bathing among the wealthy, in wooden BS filled laboriously by servants carrying heated water, was not uncommon, but bathing was also deeply, genuinely controversial, in ways that had nothing to do with laziness and everything to do with theology and terror. The medieval church cast considerable suspicion on the act of bathing, particularly for women. Immersing the body in warm water was believed to open the pores, and open pores were understood to be an open invitation. To what, exactly, depended on who you asked. Some theologians warned that warm baths inflamed carnal desires by loosening the body's natural restraint. Others argued more practically that open pores admitted disease directly into the bloodstream, bypassing whatever defenses God had built into the skin. Both arguments pointed toward the same conclusion. Bathing was risky, spiritually and physically, and a prudent woman approached it with extreme caution. Then the Black Death arrived and rewrote everything. The plague swept through Europe in waves beginning in 1347, killing somewhere between 30 and 60% of the continent's population in its first devastating passage alone. Medieval physicians, working from a medical framework built on the theory of miasma, the belief that disease travelled through corrupted air, concluded with terrible confidence that bathing was actively dangerous during plague years. Open pores meant the pestilential air could enter the body more easily. Cleanliness, in this framework, was not next to godliness, it was next to death. Across Europe, bathhouses closed. Private bathing declined sharply among people who could afford to make choices about such things, and the gap left by water was filled, heroically and inadequately, by fragrance. Perfume in the post-plague medieval world was not luxury, it was armor. The logic of miasma theory meant that surrounding yourself with pleasant, strong smells was a genuine medical strategy, a way of purifying the air immediately around your body and keeping the corrupted invisible particles of disease at bay. Rosewater was sprinkled on floors and furniture. Bundles of dried herbs, rosemary, thyme, lavender, and rue were burned in rooms and carried in the hand when moving through crowded spaces. The pomander, that small decorative ball of compressed spices and perfumed wax, was held to the nose when passing through markets or near the sick, a fragrant shield against an invisible enemy. Noblewomen layered these defences with particular care because they had more to lose and more resources to spend. Animal-based fixatives like musk and ambergris, extracted from the glands of deer and the intestines of sperm whales respectively, were among the most prized and expensive perfume ingredients available, both for their extraordinary longevity on the skin and for their warm, complex, deeply animalic quality that somehow transformed into something intoxicating when worn. Mixed with floral waters and applied to pulse points, wrists, throat, and the inside of the elbows, they created a personal atmosphere that travelled with the wearer, announcing her presence before she entered a room and lingering after she had left. It was beauty as survival strategy, glamour built on genuine terror, and it produced a sensory world so layered and so strange that to step into it now would feel like stepping into a dream half remembered from a fever. And so we arrive at the end of our journey through the cold, candlelit world of medieval beauty. But this final chapter does not end with triumph. It ends the way so many of these women's stories ended, quietly, painfully, and entirely unnecessarily, in the pursuit of an ideal that was never truly attainable and never truly worth attaining. Let us begin with the lead. White lead ceruse, the foundation of the medieval complexion, did not kill quickly. That was almost the cruelest part of it. It worked its damage slowly, the way water works on stone, so gradually that the connection between cause and effect was nearly impossible to trace. A woman might use it for years before the symptoms became undeniable. The skin would begin to grey and corrugate. The very complexion it had been applied to improve now wrecked beyond recovery. Hair thinned and fell. Teeth loosened in their sockets. The nervous system, quietly overwhelmed, began to misfire. Tremors followed. Memory fractured. And still, because the alternative was an unacceptable face, many women continued applying it. The most haunting example history offers us is Maria Coventry, Countess of Coventry, though she lived at the tail end of this era in the 18th century. Her story stretches back through centuries of the same deadly tradition. She was considered one of the great beauties of her age and was known for her lavish use of lead-based cosmetics. She died at 27. Her physician attributed her death directly to the ceruse she had refused to stop using even as her health collapsed around her. She knew what it was doing. She kept using it anyway. That is not stupidity. That is the portrait of a woman trapped inside a standard she had no language to refuse. Mercury was the other silent executioner, moving through the beauty rituals of this world, used in treatments for skin blemishes, applied in various forms to lighten pigmentation and smooth texture. Mercury poisoning produces a particularly grim constellation of symptoms: neurological damage, kidney failure, the slow dismantling of the body's most fundamental systems. Women who survived long enough sometimes developed the characteristic mercury tremor, an uncontrollable shaking that made the very hands that had applied the poison impossible to keep still. And yet, this tragedy of medieval beauty is not only physical, it is psychological and structural in ways that feel uncomfortably familiar. The standards these women chased were never stable. The forehead needed to be higher, the skin paler, the waist flatter, the expression more serenely blank. There was always another adjustment, another refinement, another ritual that promised to finally close the distance between the woman in the warped bronze mirror and the impossible ideal hanging in the painted portrait above the fireplace. That distance never closed. It was never meant to. What medieval beauty culture understood, perhaps more nakedly than our own, was that an unattainable standard is a useful thing. A woman consumed by the project of her own appearance is a woman whose energy flows inward rather than outward. The hours spent plucking and binding and applying poison were hours not spent questioning, accumulating power, or imagining a different kind of life. The beauty ritual was also always a containment ritual. We sit now in our own version of that cold stone chamber. The mirrors are clearer, the poisons more subtle, the standards delivered not by court painters but by algorithms that have studied our insecurities with scientific precision. The names have changed, the geometry has shifted, but the distance between the face we have and the face we are told we should want remains, as carefully maintained as it ever was in the 14th century. The women in those portraits could not refuse. Perhaps the most radical thing we can do across all the centuries that separate us from them is simply to try.